Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Sharp, and I'm the Director of the School of Environment and Natural Resources, and it's great to see all of you this morning or have you join us here today. As you're logging on, please feel free to share in the chat box with all attendees your name and where you are joining us from. We're glad you're here, and we'd like to learn a little bit about where everybody's coming from. And your fellow attendees can see as well. For those who are wondering, this event is set up so that everyone will be kept on mute during the program except for our speakers, and don't worry, your cameras are not on. It's crazy that we are already 3 weeks into the autumn semester. As I'm sure you all know, this semester will be administered in an unusual fashion, whether done virtually, in person, or through a combination of both. In the School of Environment and Natural Resources, we offer about 75 classes. About 25 of those have some residential sort of component. We are managing to sort of like pull things together and deliver some good classes. We know that our students are very appreciative of the opportunity to have the lab experiences. We are dealing with students not able to show up to classes because they are in isolation or quarantine dorms. So there are some challenges associated with what we're doing, but I think for the most part, we are plugging along. I have the most sympathy for our new first years this year who are missing out on a lot of ways of sort of our normal interactions and helping socialize them to college. But hopefully we'll catch up and get everybody up to speed. It's crazy creating an online culture for what was previously a very residential oriented culture, but we're doing okay. So we're happy to have you here today, and Ohio State is plugging along. In thinking about transitions and the changing of times, we are 7 days away from the fall equinox. Although there is still much uncertainty around the status of future gatherings, we can still save space to celebrate the changing seasons. Some neat things that show up that I am sure you'll appreciate include less humidity, cool nights. 49 degrees this morning was pretty chilly. I closed a lot of my windows. The beautiful fall foliage and the mouth-watering treats. Normally this time of year I go apple picking and sort of get some cinnamon donuts, and I'm gonna have to figure out trying to locate where those are at, but the farmers markets are up and running, and so I hope all of you have been able to enjoy the bounty of this season. Although COVID has impacted our lives in different ways, people across the country are united in looking forward and toward recovery. We need spaces like national parks and public lands to breathe, to exercise, and to connect. During past EPN events, there have been stories upon stories of participants' outdoor adventures and experiences throughout the Ohio landscape. As a resource for environmental professionals, we pride ourselves in hosting programs that include these nostalgic and meaningful conversations. I myself am excited about today's program with national parks. I have a very soft spot for them. I have had a chance to work a season at Glacier National Park, and I worked for the concession in Grand Canyon once. And it's been a family tradition of ours to visit national parks. Unfortunately, this year we were not able to sort of visit Banff, which is actually a Canadian park, but we were not able to visit that location. But my daughter, who just recently graduated from high school, and some of her friends, managed to do a great adventure this summer and travel out to the Badlands, Yellowstone, and Grand Teton National Park. And it was one of the highlights of her summer. And I was so delighted she was able to take advantage of that trip to celebrate her graduation from high school, which was not allowed to have its normal graduation. National parks are a special place. Before we begin our program, the school acknowledges Central Ohio as the traditional homeland of the Shawnee Nation, Miami, Wyandot, and other indigenous nations who have strong ties to these lands. Today, individuals from a broad range of indigenous backgrounds call Columbus and Central Ohio home. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and relatives and relations past, present, and emerging. Let us now move into today's program. I'm very excited about this topic area, and we are fortunate that Nicole Jackson, EPN program coordinator and alum of our school, reached out and connected us with Nate, John, and James to develop today's program. Nicole is a Next Generation Advisory Council member of the National Parks Conservation Association. She has found it to be a valuable leadership opportunity to explore effective methods of engaging younger generations in national park advocacy and production. The National Park Service is an agency of the federal government of the United States that manages all national parks, many national monuments, and other conservation and historical properties with various title designations. On August 4th, the Great American Outdoors Act was finally signed into law, which has accomplished two important objectives for nature and nature lovers alike. This includes addressing maintenance backlogs in our parks and funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Additional focus is also turning to equality and conservation, including whether agencies like the National Park Service have addressed its diversity and inclusion problem. Nate, our first speaker, is joining us from New Mexico, 2 hours ahead of us. We appreciate you joining us so early to share today. We will have time for audience Q&A throughout this program. We invite your comments and questions and have built in about 5 minutes following each mini presentation for speakers to answer questions as well as the full panel around 11:15 a.m. Please notice that in the chat box, Nicole has posted some basic directions. If you have general comments, post those in the chat box.
Again, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A section for our panelists. If you have IT issues, thank you for the comments that are in the chat box. Please feel free to keep us posted on what you're seeing from the video. Thank you and welcome, Nate Welch.
Good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm presenting to you from my home park right now at Pecos National Historical Park in New Mexico. I'm about 30 minutes away from Santa Fe. It's great to be here. I'm an alum as well. I graduated from The Ohio State University in March of 2012. But I have a short presentation for you to kind of get the ball rolling, a little bit of background information about myself and my career, but some more tools and things that may help you out in getting started if you're interested in working for the National Park Service. So I'm going to share my screen here. And let's see. Give me a moment here as I kick things off. There we go. So this first slide is me actually here presenting an interpretive program to some visitors at the park. Pecos National Historical Park, just a quick background of this particular park, what it's about. It's an ancestral pueblo that began in 1325. But people have been around for thousands upon thousands of years. But it's not just the public we talk about. We have a Civil War battle that occurred out here. We have ranching history, the Santa Fe Trail, Route 66, you name it. There's a lot of different things to see and things to learn about here at Pecos. But let's get into what the National Park Service is. So some of you probably already know this because, of course, we learned it in school. I learned it there in school as well as you all. But the National Park Service is a federal agency that is part of the Department of the Interior. And we were originally established in 1916 as to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm mostly on the education portion. I'm an interpretive park ranger. So I'm part of that 20,000 employees that the National Park Service employs. And I work at just one of the 419 national park sites. But I've worked at many others. So a little bit later, I'll go through what my career had looked like. But first, why did I choose to become a park ranger? Well, the first and foremost thing was family and childhood influences. And so the top picture there is the Rocky Mountain National Park sign at the entranceway to the national park. The reason why I chose that picture to represent this portion of my life is because for many years, my family traveled out west to see the national parks. And Rocky Mountain was the one that we had seen and visited for many, many years, as I had family living in the Fort Collins area, not far from the park itself. So it was a heavy influence on me to go on these trips and visit these parks. I probably earned over hundreds of junior ranger badges, but that was my start. But then as I grew up a little bit more and got into the Boy Scouts, I'm an Eagle Scout, and so I was able to build upon my skill set and really love the outdoors. But then the education portion came in. And so being with the School of Environment and Natural Resources, I learned a little bit more about the nuances of the National Park Service and the federal government, and even education and interpretation. I really dived into that. And then working life began while I was in college, working at summer camps, for instance, with the Conservancy for Cuyahoga Valley National Park. It's a friends group, a partner group that works directly with Cuyahoga Valley. And there's many different groups that are out there working with all different national parks, including Rocky Mountain, and including here with us at Pecos. We actually have a friends group here as well. And so to give you a snapshot of what my NPS adventures were like, so Cuyahoga Valley National Park is where I started out as an actual park ranger. Now, while I did do the, I did work as the national, through the Conservancy, I began my NPS career as a park ranger at Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and that's near Cleveland, Ohio, if you don't know. It's a great park, it's beautiful, there's a lot of cool things to see out there, but I really began my journey as a junior, actually in college, right between my junior and senior year as a step park ranger. And you can actually do that as well. It's under a different name. It's called Pathways, and you can search that on USA Jobs, Pathways, and all those different opportunities are out there. But after college, searching around, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life and how this career was going to work, I began to go across the nation to John D. Fausto Benz National Monument, which is in Oregon. I worked there for the summer. And then from there, I just kind of traveled around the United States. But as you probably notice here, that a lot of the parks probably are in the south, are mostly concentrated in the Southwest. So I worked at Timpanogos Cave National Monument, which is in near Salt Lake City, Utah. Worked at Coronado National Memorial, which is right on the U.S.-Mexican border in southern Arizona. Went back to Timpanogos, went to Zion National Park in southern Utah, and Grand Canyon National Park. I worked there for 2 seasons, consecutive summers, including the actual centennial of the National Park Service, which was pretty exciting. And then here, I got a permanent job here at Pecos National Historical Park just 3 years ago. In fact, I just became career permanent, which is a huge deal when you get to this point. But I started out as a seasonal park ranger, which most people do. And it's a lot of fun if you love to travel. But at the same token, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to really get started. So what do I do for my job as an interpretive park ranger? Well, for most of my job, I provide interpretive programs to the public, ranging from various topics, various different venues and things to discuss and learn about. And so you really have to dive into that knowledge bank. And every season, it was like a 2-week hardcore learning session of what it is at that park. And so the picture collage that I have here shows to you some of the things that I've done, like dress up as a Spanish conquistador at Coronado, to leading hikes in the ledges at Cuyahoga Valley, to leading cave tours at Timpanogos Cave, to doing just patio talks at Zion or Grand Canyon National Parks. So I've done a variety of different programming. But along with that, I also do education programs. For instance, at Grand Canyon, I actually participated, my job mainly was an education ranger. So I did a lot of different things with schools that came out to the Grand Canyon to see it for the first time. And these kids are coming from even long distances like Tampa, Florida. It was a really neat experience and I loved it. But I do that here too with local schools. I do interpretive programming and education programs with the local kids here at Pecos. But then one of the biggest things that I do is I staff a visitor center desk. Not that great as far as the most interesting work, but you find the interesting points in it. You get to talk to and visit with people all over the world, and it's quite an amazing experience. But the other thing that I do, a lot of collateral duties, is I write up interpretive media, including social media and website content, site bulletins, wayside panels. I do a lot of different things for my job. And so, and that's just what I do. Some of my other coworkers do things like volunteer management. Some other folks in my division, they help plan special events. They run the visitor center. They do all kinds of different things. So being an interpretive park ranger really is working with the people and working for the people, as the service industry really is. But there are many different other career options that you can take within the national parks. You could be a visitor and resource protection ranger. So that's someone who basically is law enforcement. They know all the laws and policies. They patrol the parks, make sure everybody's safe and everything is safe, from the resources and to the people. You could do administrative. You're doing all the payroll. You're making sure that hiring is all good to go, and all kinds of background things like budgets and things like that. And then there's the resource side, which you're diving into a variety of different resources depending on the park you're at. Here at Pecos, we have an archaeological resource, and so dive into that resource and make sure that things are protected, things are preserved. We research what is here. But then even at Grand Canyon and Zion, for instance, you have geologists that are working to see what's going on with the geology of those parks. But you're also looking after the animals. So you got biologists, and you got plant biologists and wildlife biologists. So you have a whole gambit of things that you could do with the National Park Service. So quickly, some tips to get into the NPS. Volunteer at your local park, state, local, federal, whatever it is. Get in there and volunteer. I did a couple volunteer stints as well. And it's great to kind of get started and get your foot in the door in that way. But then looking for internships, especially while you're in college. The Student Conservation Association, AmeriCorps, the Pathways programs I spoke about earlier, those things will help you. Set up a usajobs.gov profile. So the profile is USA Jobs is basically the main job bank for all of the federal government. So if you want to get into the National Park Service or Forest Service or BLM or whatever federal agency, land management agency that you want to work for, start setting up a profile right now and put in your resume. You can actually build a resume within the USA Jobs. And start looking at the different types of jobs that are out there and seeing what they are. Even if you just apply for a couple ones that you're interested in, maybe you don't qualify for just yet, you'll at least get to see what they're looking at as you go through the questions. And obviously, the last one is is a given. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. With the national parks and the National Park Service, you do have to travel extensively, especially if you're going to do seasonal work. But that's also the fun part. You get to travel and see different things. As you can see by my collage, there's all kinds of cool things that are out there that you can see and spend time with. And that is it for my presentation. I want to thank you all for coming along and joining myself for this portion of the presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask away. So I'm going to stop. Well, I'm going to leave my share on. Actually, I'm going to stop it. And then who has questions? I saw there's someone in the question here. So you mentioned getting started in NPS and EE in general is very time and resource intensive. This takes immense financial privilege. Since not everyone has the ability to volunteer or work for no low income based on their personal situation, is the NPS taking any steps to help these groups start a successful career as well? So in some ways, yes, there is a way that there is a couple avenues you could do this. The Pathways is a great way to get started. That is a good step because you actually get paid a GS rate, so the federal rate. You know, just to kind of get started with that. There are college kind of education scholarships, if you will, that you can also apply for that will help you. AmeriCorps is one of those that, while it is low income based, it will actually help you with your education costs. So working at a local state park more or less value than volunteering? I would say it's definitely good to have that background if you're working, if you're actually getting paid. There's not really much difference, really. I would say it's about the same. So, yeah. Is there any other questions? Talk about housing availability during your seasonal experiences. Well, Mark, I know Mark personally, so Mark, that's a great question. The housing experiences kind of, they vary depending on the park you're at. But the housing experience is just amazing because you're within the national park. Some park housing is beautiful. You're in like an apartment style like Grand Canyon, or you're in a nice little cabin. For instance, like at Grand Canyon, I was in an apartment complex, but I'm like 5-minute walk from the Grand Canyon. It is pretty amazing. Here at Pecos, as a permanent ranger especially, I don't have housing. It's kind of hard to find. So when you search the job announcements, they should tell you if they have housing available or not. So that is something that you want to kind of pay attention to. Do you pay for the housing, or is it part of your salary? It is actually part of your salary. If you're getting park housing, it is part of your salary. So it's deducted. So you technically don't even see it. You don't even know it's gone. But it is automatically deducted. Role of national parks on national air quality. Would you be able to expand on the importance? Yeah, so air quality definitely is important. Obviously, as you all have probably been hearing and seeing all over the news, you got the fires that are devastating all of the West Coast. It's definitely something that we pay attention to. In fact, most of those parks are shutting down as we speak to sort of discourage folks from going in and breathing in their air quality. But of course, fires, while necessary, are something that we need to pay attention to as well. Do you need to do the ranger training just like the law enforcement rangers? So for my portion of the job, interpretation education, I don't actually have to do any of that training. You can if you want, especially if that's the avenue you would like to do, but it's not something I've actually had to do. Most of the training is just education and interpretation wise. Around when would be a good time to start looking for internships with parks? So actually, for internships, now is the time to start looking. Most parks will have put out their seasonal announcements within the next couple of months. Usually it's October, November, December timeframe is when they're really putting out those. And it's kind of been funky. I'm not in this sort of realm, so I can't really say exactly. But essentially it's been broken down by the various regions for that. Are there park ranger jobs or certain duties where you conduct research on plants and animals? Yes, so that's the wildlife biologists, or so for instance, here at this park, we actually have a park biologist, so we'll go out and do the research and management of the plants and animals, so that is a portion of the job. Even us, as an intern, we can go out there and help it out. How do you move to other parks once you started as at a national park? You have to apply separately each time? Yes, you do have to apply separately each time. However, you could be under what's called rehire status. So you could be like at Pecos, you can have rehire status and come back. How much would you say you have, how much say do you have developed your own interpretive programs? For the most part, you have fair amount of range to do so. You have a lot of different time to do it, and you have the world at your disposal. You can do whatever you'd like. Of course, there are others to help you out. So And I've never met Betty, but Betty is pretty awesome. She's probably a very high up on my list of folks that just, she's a hero to me. She's awesome. So yes. Well, I think I'm kind of running out of time.
Yeah, I think we have time for about one more question if you want to answer, and then we can move on to our next speaker. And if you want to stick around and answer some of those questions behind the scenes, feel free to do so, Nate.
Yeah, I definitely will be answering some of these other questions through chat. So if you need, or through the answer question here. So actually, I'll turn it over and I'll just start typing out answers. That way we can continue on with the rest of the webinar. But thank you all for allowing me to participate. I gave Nicole permission to give out my contact information, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Nate. We appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Nate. Great presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm John Garder. I'm on the Government Affairs team with the National Parks Conservation Association. So 100 years ago, well, a little more, 1916, some gentlemen started the National Park Service through a lot of work, advocacy with Congress. And they said, this is great, we got it done. And now we need a nonprofit public interest advocacy group to look out for these places over the years. So in 1919, they started our organization. And so Nate gave great perspective on the Park Service side. And now I want to share with you all some of the work we do addressing challenges that the park system faces. And I put together a presentation for you. And this should be it. So, already mentioned was the Great American Outdoors Act that passed Congress this past July and was signed by the president in early August. It was a major conservation victory. It took a lot of work by a lot of people addressing a couple of problems that I'll discuss with you. We had a lot of bipartisan champions in Congress that we worked with over years to make this happen. That includes actually Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, Republican, and he was joined sort of championing the maintenance side to repair park resources, which is basically half the bill, by Democratic Senator Mark Warner in Virginia, Angus King, independent in Maine, and Lamar Alexander, Republican in Tennessee. Those are just some of the many congressional champions of this bill. But it would not have happened without the work of nonprofits, including ourselves, but a lot of other people, like Nicole, who flew in to help this out, this effort out, and local businesses and a lot of other stakeholders who really pushed Congress to get this done. As a nonprofit, here's just a quick snapshot of some of the things that we did to help contribute to the cause and push Congress to pass this bill, which again was a major achievement. We flew a lot of people in. We had a lot of, we called on a lot of our members and supporters to make phone calls and send letters to Congress. We had folks who flew in and had thousands of meetings. We worked in DC to cultivate all these bipartisan co-sponsors. And so that was just some of the work that we did to make the bill happen. So there are two parts to the bill. Nate talked about the Park Service mission to preserve these awesome historic and natural resources, and to do so for the enjoyment of present and future generations. Unfortunately, that can't happen when facilities and historic sites are degrading. There are a lot of old facilities, both things that accommodate and facilitate the visiting experience, as well as just old historic buildings that were built when the park system was started, or that were around even earlier that the park system protected. All this old stuff just has not received the investment that it's needed over the years, and as a result, a $12 billion deferred maintenance backlog has developed. And you can see from that graph what that looks like. Half of that, the right half, is transportation systems. The traditional funding source for that is primarily through the transportation bill that's passed every few years, and NPCA has done a lot of advocacy to increase that funding, but it still hasn't been enough. All of the other stuff, its chief funding source is through the annual appropriations, the funding bill that's passed by Congress every year, but that too has been insufficient. Helpful are a lot of philanthropic efforts to contribute to repairing facilities, as well as park fees. More than half of your fees when you pay at a park, those go towards maintenance as well. But this has not been enough. So this bill dedicates funding for $6.5 billion of that deferred maintenance backlog, as well as some money for national wildlife refuges, national forests, Bureau of Land Management lands, and Bureau of Indian Education schools. What does it look like in Ohio? Well, here's just a snapshot of the parks, 8 National Park Service sites in Ohio, chiefly cultural sites, but a big one is Cuyahoga Valley National Park, east of Cleveland, I believe. I haven't been there yet, but it's a huge park that accommodates a lot of recreational opportunities, cycling paths, and so forth. It's got a really big deferred maintenance backlog, as you can see. Hopefully you can read this. Just gives a snapshot of Cuyahoga and what their deferred maintenance needs look like. You can see that there are a ton of buildings, and that's most of their backlog. I should note that the Park Service has the most facilities, the most assets, they call them, of any federal agency outside the Department of Defense. They just have a lot of stuff, and you can see just at this one park alone how much they have in the way of infrastructure. So when they don't get the investment that's needed, no surprise that that backlog grows. So below is just some examples of some of the things that they need that we hope will get taken care of next year. There are a lot of projects in the mix, so we'll see. So that's sort of what it looks like there. Here are some quick opportunities at some sites around the country, recreational areas, areas of natural wonder, and historic sites as well. The water line that serves the South Rim, where millions of people go at the Grand Canyon every year, has been falling apart. That's a major, large project that we wouldn't be surprised on the list to be funded this next year. At Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, there are a number of needs as well. Important historic site, including the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the late Dr. King preached and where his funeral was held, as well as the late John Lewis. His funeral was held there as well. Very important member of Congress who was critical in the civil rights movement. Gateway National Recreation Area, which serves millions of people outside New York City. You can see there are some really big projects there. And Yellowstone, their roads get a lot of tires on them and have been needing major investments for a long time. It would not be surprising to see those funded in this bill. I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly. This sort of gets at the technical piece of what we do. So on that left side in the photos is that potable water line. A lot of visitors don't think about it when they use the drinking fountain at Grand Canyon, but you can see that sort of one of many ruptures that happen in that line, which costs a lot. On the right side was a tour I took at Harper's Ferry National Historical Park, which has been important in several ways for our history. There's a building that has been protected on the outside thanks to partners, but on the inside it's completely dilapidated, as you can see. These are some of the things that we look forward to this bill funding, but this requires us as an advocacy group to track now the implementation of this bill, right? So we can't just rest on our laurels and say, awesome, Park Service, do your job. We want to make sure that things go well. And so we're monitoring the process, which is the Park Service having a complex project selection process. There are going to be a lot of larger projects that get done this year, and that opens room for smaller projects to get done through the annual appropriations bill, and we'll be continuing to advocate for that traditional funding source as well. There's going to be a whole process for review at the secretarial level at the Department of the Interior after the Park Service does their work, and then the Office of Management and Budget, and then they'll get that list up to Congress for them to consider. As we move forward, there are a lot of staffing concerns. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And they need to get some folks on the ground in the various offices that are needed to make sure that these projects can actually get done. The next president's budget will come out February or March or even April if there's a new administration in there. We'll see what the list is proposed for the following year, because this year funds projects for 5 years. They're not all shovel ready. It's just interesting and worth noting that you need engineers, you need to contract construction crews, you need to procure the materials that are necessary, and you need to do the kinds of reviews that are important for these places of historic and natural wonder. You need to use the National Environmental Policy Act to make sure you're not going to trample sensitive natural resources when you're doing these projects, and the National Historic Preservation Act to make sure you're doing things right in the way of restoring these historic facilities. So that's sort of half of the bill, which was one bill that was then combined with an effort that's been going on for decades. NPCA has been working with others through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the LWCF Coalition, to advocate for this awesome program that takes funding from offshore drilling and uses it to allow the, at least on the federal side of the program, to allow Park Service and other federal agencies to purchase properties within parks when they are available for sale by willing sellers. And that prevents incompatible commercial and residential development within the borders of these places. So Acadia, for example, on the right, LWCF was critical to making sure that that park could be protected and be the natural wonder that provides great experiences for millions of visitors every year. On the left side was essentially a trophy home that was built in the middle of Zion National Park a few years ago. It shows the kind of thing that can happen when LWCF is unable to allow for the agency to purchase parcels where people can build homes. They can build gas stations, you know, based on, there are some limits based on local zoning laws, but, you know, development is certainly incompatible in terms of the visiting experience, the protection of natural and historic resources, potential introduction of fire danger, potential sedimentation of streams, a lot of problems that you can have when this development happens. And so this program has been subject to the annual appropriations process every year, and that has not funded the program with the funding that has been needed to provide for these opportunities. So this bill dedicates $900 million annually in perpetuity to provide for this fund. Just a few opportunities coming up. At Grand Teton National Park, there are some in-holdings held by the state, and those have been at considerable threat of development. NPCA has worked with others for a decade to work with the Park Service and partners to get those places protected. A lot of people would love to build some trophy mansions in the middle of one of the most amazing parks in the country. And so there is still a parcel that is within that park that is at threat of development, and LWCF could provide for that. Outside LA, there's a great park that is enjoyed by a lot of people who live in an urban area who can go out to this place and see some amazing wildlife and enjoy views and trails. There is an acquisition there that could get funded this next year through the Outdoors Act that protects the visiting experience on trails and increases some intact wildlife habitat to help provide for wildlife habitat connectivity there. And then at Glacier Bay National Park, there are some in-holdings that are important to the Hoona Tlingit there, and also are important for protecting iconic habitat and would allow visitor access to campfish, wildlife view, and do a lot of other awesome things. We do have some concerns I think I won't touch on due to lack, I won't get into due to lack of time. Suffice to say, this gets at our role in advocacy. This administration, unfortunately, has not historically been supportive of the federal LWCF program. So we want to make sure that they implement this law without getting into anything that could undermine the law, which is questionable legal interpretation, and bowing to the pressure from interest groups and some members of Congress who resent federal land ownership and don't want to see this program be successful. So we are being watchful to make sure that there isn't any funny business with LWCF. There are still many, many more opportunities. This was put together by the Trust for Public Land. I realize it's not a great graphic, but it shows some of the many opportunities around the country for LWCF acquisition. And just in one place like Saguaro National Park outside Tucson, there is an opportunity there to provide a linkage between other protected public lands, which is important for wildlife habitat. And these kinds of wildlife corridors are critical as we look at the impacts of climate change and the need for wildlife to adapt to changing habitat. There are various programs under LWCF, and I talked about the federal program, but an important opportunity for communities is one of the programs, the state and local grant funding program. LWCF, the Park Service provides resources and expertise working with states and communities through a competitive process to provide grants for close to home recreational opportunities. There are many communities, as you probably know, that lack access to recreation. And now, of course, during this terrible pandemic, people crave those opportunities more than ever, and not just on our federal public lands and state parks, but in for some of these playgrounds and other recreational facilities, local parks, and even swimming pools, baseball fields, and other recreational facilities. So the stateside LWCF will have additional opportunities to support community recreation with this additional funding that the program will receive. And the advocacy doesn't stop here. We're going to continue to advocate for deferred maintenance funding through traditional funding sources, but it's not the Park Service's only challenge. Nate talked about all the awesome roles that Park Service staff play. Unfortunately, as you can see here, as visitation has gone up, unfortunately, we've seen a decrease over the years in Park Service staffing. About 16 or 17% increase in visitation, and the same in terms of a reduction in park staffing levels. We're talking, more than 2,000 people, it's actually more than 2,000 the way it's measured, but suffice to say, a lot of interpreters like Nate, wildlife specialists, cultural resource experts, park managers, educators, air quality specialists, water quality specialists, all the people you need to protect resources and to serve the public. So we are going to be advocating to raise attention in media and Congress about the loss of our Park Service rangers and other staff, and do what we can to get Congress to bring those rangers back into our parks and the offices that support those parks. And finally, moving forward, there is a lot here, but again, to give you perspective as an advocacy organization, we're going to continue to have conversations with the Department of the Interior and the Park Service on the implementation of this law and their funding challenges. We're going to get that deferred maintenance list that will go to Congress perhaps as soon as the end of this month, and make sure that those projects are legitimately addressing the Park Service's greatest needs. And then we'll discuss that project list with the Appropriations Committee that has oversight over spending, as well as the Natural Resources Committees that have jurisdiction over our national parks. And we are going to continue to talk to partners to find out what their perspectives and priorities are. And then moving forward, we're going to work with the Park Service and make sure that the list moving forward for the next 4 fiscal years after this one is a solid one that addresses the highest priority needs. And again, we're going to keep lobbying for traditional funding sources and for that park operational funding to address that staffing shortfall. And then we're going to look at opportunities to have these LWCF projects and deferred maintenance projects intersect with community priorities and with some of the things that are important for adapting to a changing climate, which I talked about, and providing sustainable facilities and facilities that are more resilient to storm surges and just more resilient materials so that these facilities don't break down as quickly as they did before. And then we're going to look to defend LWCF from continuing attacks that we will undoubtedly see from the Congress and possibly efforts to undermine it by the administration, which we talked a little about. We're going to look at those continuing opportunities to do what we can to make sure that this bill is a success, that our parks are better funded while we work on all the other issues that are of concern to us, increasing visitation, which is awesome, but provides a number of challenges for park staffing and resource protection. Certainly the health of park staff and visitors during the COVID pandemic, as well as air quality, water quality, wildlife protection, and the many other things that MPCA works on. So happy to answer questions through the chat, and that's probably somewhere around the time I've been allotted. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I can't tell you how happy I am to be back in Ohio, even digitally. As it happens, I had the pleasure of doing a presentation similar to the one I'm going to share with you today at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park about this time last year. So being back in Ohio, I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit of my experience in our national parks. So I'll go ahead and start my screen and hopefully everyone can see. Just to give you an ounce of information about me, I'm a freelance journalist and independent media producer, and I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm an adjunct faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And here I teach a class called Outdoors for All. And I'm also speaking to you from the ancestral homeland of the Oneida Nation that has been known for time immemorial as Dejo. And I hope that you always recognize whatever ancestral lands that you now call home. To start, and it's remarkable that so many of our presenters today mentioned the Grand Canyon, because that's where I think I'll start our conversation today. This picture was taken in 2016. It was the summer of the National Park Service Centennial, and I was excited to be part of a 15-person, 5-boat flotilla from one end of the Grand Canyon to the other. We actually traveled from the Put-in-at-Least ferry all the way to Diamond Creek, an expedition that took about 14 days, 227 miles, fully supported down the Colorado River. And having spent much of my professional life as an avid outdoors person, this is the first time I've had the opportunity to have an experience like this, because as many of you probably know, the Grand Canyon, like many of our national parks, has some restrictions when it comes to who and how many people can utilize this area. And for the last 10 years, or the 10 years prior to this, my good friend Jim Moss, who is a guide on the Colorado River, as well as a lawyer and a writer in the outdoor industry, had put me on his list of invitees for his permit for a Grand Canyon trip as a private expedition. And essentially what that means is, unlike times when you use an outfitter or professional guide service, the Park Service sets aside a certain number of permits that allows individual groups to take this very exclusive trip. And we've been on the river for about 3 days, and we're sitting around a campfire and we're talking, and Jim leans over to me and says, you know, I've been on this river 40 times and I've led dozens of trips personally, but you're the very first African-American I've ever seen down here. And that was really striking to me because as a person of color, I've always noticed that I'm not typically the type of person that you see in many of our national parks. But for someone who had such a long experience in these areas, I was kind of taken aback that he had seen so few people of color. Now, it's important to recognize that the Grand Canyon, because it is a very limited natural resource, only 29,000 people a year will make the same trip that we just took. And if you take a look at the canyon rim, there's plenty of people of color that you'll see looking in and down into the canyon. In fact, every year, 4.5 to 5 million people visit the Grand Canyon. And as it happens, myself as a young college student with my very good friend John Mayer and I actually hiked down from the rim to the camp on the canyon floor. So it's not like there are no people of color, including myself, who actually spend time in the Grand Canyon. But when you take a look at who spends time in the Grand Canyon in this particular capacity, a whitewater river trip, the number of people that can take this trip is automatically very limited. But at the same time, you also have a limited access, not only from the standpoint of economics, because a commercial trip can cost at a minimum $5,000, and a private trip requires you to have a personal relationship with someone like my friend Jim, who will invite you on a trip like this. Because again, it's important to recognize that we do indeed see people of color at our national parks. In fact, on this particular trip, I saw plenty of them on the canyon rim. But as Jim noticed, and as I noticed myself after he made his comment, I was the only person of color that I saw on our entire trip for 2 solid weeks. Because it's important to recognize that we find ourselves in an area where we're trying to hopefully de-urbanize our homes and find ourselves in areas that are a little bit more accessible to a wider cross-section of the American public. Some of you might recognize this photograph as the overlook of Los Angeles, California. This is where I grew up. And my beginnings of my interest in outdoor recreation actually starts here in the city of Los Angeles. And if you take a look at this map, that's the exact location of my home. And the photograph that I just showed you was taken from an area called the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook. And from this spot, it's basically a unit of the state of California. It's a state park, which is located right here. So very close to where I grew up, a little less than 3 miles. And if you go there today, there's an amazing series of hiking trails. The access for nature and recreation is amazing. If you go there today, there's an interpretive ranger that will lead you on hiking trips. Hundreds of people visit every day just to walk the trails and to experience the beautiful setting. And it's also a very racially and ethnically diverse visitation area where you see people from all walks of life enjoying this beautiful outdoor recreation area. But when I was a kid in the 60s and early 70s, it actually looked more like this. This particular part of Los Angeles continues to be one of the most ecologically challenged and industrially polluted areas in the state. And when you take a look at where this particular area is, it's in a primarily African-American enclave. A lot of the pollution and exploitation of the natural environment was taking place in this particular area. And it was because of the work that was being done through the 1960s and early 70s that basically created much of what we see today. And actually, my story of outdoor recreation actually starts really at the heart of the civil rights movement. Now, you probably all recognize the guy on your left. The guy on the right is my father. Billy Gene Mills was the first African-American to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1952. In fact, he was also one of the first African-American city councilmen for the city of Los Angeles. And in the mid-60s, when Martin Luther King Jr. came to visit Los Angeles, he actually met with my father among several other African-American leaders. And in this particular photograph that was in the Los Angeles Times, it reads, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. discusses with Billy Mills some of the problems in King's campaign to win equal rights in the Southern integration movement now being conducted in Alabama. Now, what's remarkable about this photograph is that it kind of frames my cultural and social legacy, not only as an environmentalist, but also a civil rights activist. My dad was prominently engaged in much of what was going on through the 1960s and early 70s. Here in a photograph with Bobby Kennedy, here again with his brother Robert Kennedy, and then Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley. That's my dad to Bradley's right. What is especially remarkable about my growing up was that as a political family, much of what my mom and dad were doing was taking responsibility for the civil rights activities that were going on in our community. And in this photograph, this is one of the pictures that was always taken every year of my family. My dad went on to become a Superior Court judge. My mom has a doctorate in education. My brother Bill on the far right was, and still is, a Los Angeles attorney. My sisters, Karen and Carol, grew up to become teachers like my mom. My brother John became a yoga and fitness instructor still in Los Angeles. And as the youngest of 5, I became what I like to describe as the outdoor guy. From a very early age, I had an opportunity to spend time in the outdoors. And much of my growing up included time spent in wild and scenic areas, complete with family vacations by the lake. And what was especially important was as I grew up, I was actually able to spend time both recreationally, but also professionally in the outdoors. Shortly after college, I became a wilderness guide and a rock climbing and backpacking instructor, at the time working for the University of California outing club called Cal Adventures. But I also went on personal trips. In this photograph, making our attempt on the summit of Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the lower 48 states. And then as a professional, after a career in guiding, I worked for a company many of you have probably heard of called the North Face. I was hired as a regional sales representative to become the lead salesperson for products for the North Face for the Midwest territory. And that basically led me to a career in sales and marketing in outdoor recreation. And from that began a longer career in world travel, in expeditions, quite literally all over the planet. But one of the things that you'll notice in many of the photographs that I'm sharing with you today is that many of them have one thing in common. And that is, if you haven't noticed, is that I was typically, if not always, the only person of color in many of my experiences. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to figure out how it is that we got to that place, how it is that we have so little and limited representation when it comes to people of color in the outdoors. And after a long career in sales and marketing, I decided to take my storytelling talents and change into a career in the field of journalism. And in 2009, I created the blog and podcast series called The Joy Trip Project, now in its 12th season. And through this platform, I tell stories about outdoor recreation and environmental conservation and practices of sustainable living. And from that, I basically define much of what we're going to be talking about today. Because much of my experience actually goes back to my childhood and my love of the outdoors, particularly in our national parks. If you take a look at Yosemite Valley, that's where much of my career began. In fact, in 2009, in the first season of the Joy Trip Project, I had an opportunity to become very engaged in the creation of a documentary film many of you have probably seen called The National Parks: America's Best Idea. And this particular film series tells the long story of the creation of our national park system. And in 2009, and the lead up to the release of the film, I had the privilege of spending time in Yosemite Valley with Ken Burns, the gentleman on the right, and a guy who looks a lot like John Muir, who's actually an interpretive storyteller by the name of Lee Stetson, who in Period Clothing and Voice tells the story of the national park system from its inception. And at this time, I had a great opportunity to really learn about what it is to be involved in the national park system from two people who actually had a lot of knowledge and information about it. And many of you will probably recognize this photograph of John Muir talking to Teddy Roosevelt, looking into Yosemite Valley in the dawn of the national park system. In 1903, at the very beginning of the idea behind environmental conservation and preservation, Muir and Roosevelt decided that they were going to create something special. But one of the things that I didn't know, and this is one of the great things that came out of these conversations, was that at the time, in order to protect and preserve these wild and scenic places, Roosevelt, before the creation of the National Park Service, sent in the US Cavalry and also the US Army to protect and patrol these wild and scenic places. And from the year 1903 to 1906, 400 of those soldiers were African-American members of the US Cavalry, a unit traditionally and for long-standing known as the Buffalo Soldiers. African-American men of color who were charged with protecting, preserving these natural spaces. And it was also here that I learned about Charles Young, who was the third African-American to graduate from West Point, but he was the leader of the Buffalo Soldiers and ostensibly one of the first superintendents of a national park, specifically Sequoia National Park. And as it happens, and almost coincidentally, his home is now a national monument in the state of Ohio. Charles Young went on to help to protect and preserve these wild and scenic places in such a way that many of the things that the Buffalo Soldiers did are still in use today. For example, the creation of the very first Arboretum or Natural Sciences Museum was created in Sequoia, created by the Buffalo Soldiers. They also built the road leading up to the summit of Mount Whitney, the highest peak in North America. And they went on to tell these amazing stories about the role that men of color played in the creation of our national parks. But what's remarkable is that having grown up in California, having worked in the outdoor industry, having been engaged and involved in outdoor recreation in the state of California for my entire life, this is the first time I'm hearing this story. And it had kind of a radicalizing effect on me, because when you take a look at the low rates of participation today relative to the number of people of color who were in positions of authority at the turn of the last century, when there was over 400 African-Americans in uniform protecting our national parks, today the numbers are very few. My friend Shelton Johnson, not unlike Lee Stetson, tells the story of the Buffalo Soldiers in period voice and clothing as one of a very small number, in fact fewer than 5, permanently stationed African-American park rangers in Yosemite today. And it makes you wonder, what is it that created this sudden rift, that we have a divide between who is spending time in our national parks and who doesn't? Because it's important that once we tell these stories, these very captivating tales of not only conservation but adventure, that we put people of color in the place of environmental conservationists. And so that when Ken Burns took the story of the national parks to the Obama White House in 2009, Shelton Johnson was actually in the audience to tell the story of the Buffalo Soldiers directly to President Obama. And I personally think that, not unlike Roosevelt meeting with John Muir, Shelton Johnson meeting with Barack Obama helped to set the tone for what would be one of the most successful public land management presidential administrations in American history. During Obama's presidency, over 26 national parks and monuments were created, more than any president in US history. And I think that in no small way, this meeting very early in his administration had a lot to do with that. Because as we continue to tell the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, of the roles that African Americans in particular, but people of color in general, have played in the preservation of our wild and scenic places, we suddenly find ourselves with a role and a place in this history. And so as we continue to go on, we can hopefully see ourselves as part of this great national heritage, which is indeed America's best idea, quite simply because it is inclusive of everyone. And so through our work as interpreters and through our work as public land managers, we have to figure out how we can make these areas more accessible and more engaging for more people. especially as we take a look at what the adventure gap ultimately means. Let me just break it down for you a little bit. Now, currently, Black Americans represent 13.1% of the US population, but we only represent 2 to 7% of national park visitors. Now, if there was no racial disparity, these numbers would be much closer together. Now, the question is, how can we close the gap between percentage of the population and percentage of park visitation? Now, it's important to take a look at the fact that from the year 2000 to the year 2014, the nation's Black population grew 35% faster than the population as a whole. If that is indeed the case, that means that the African-American population is starting to expand, so much so that the Black population is expected to grow from 45.7 million to 74.5 million people, making up 17% of the US population by the year 2060. And statistical information lets us know that the US minority population will actually be a minority by the year 2045. And especially if you take a look at the number of young people that will be involved in that emerging demographic, that means that a very high percentage of the US population will indeed be people of color. So much so that, that there will be more people of color than there are currently white people. And that begs the question, what happens if we fail to engage this emerging demographic? What happens if nothing changes and a majority of the population has no affinity for nature? And essentially that poses the biggest problem of where will our new park stewards and advocates ultimately come from. So I'm going to pose a really basic question. How did we get here? And we can literally go all the way back to Jim Crow segregation in an era primarily known as redlining, where we had very clear distinctions between where people could and couldn't live. In fact, if you take a look at where I grew up in Los Angeles, this is actually, if you take a look at a redlining map of the 1930s, this region where I grew up was clearly designated as a spot for Black people only. And that basically explains why the area that is now the Baldwin Hills Scenic Overlook is so economically and ecologically depressed. Ultimately, when we take a look at the outdoors, much of our wildest scenic places, as well as our cities, were segregated. Our modes of transportation, even our parks and beaches were indeed segregated. There were physical restrictions as to where people could and couldn't go. And with that comes a variety of social impacts. Basically, despite the fact that we have emancipation at the end of the Civil War, we have a system of de facto segregation. Also, compulsory urbanization, meaning that people of color are restricted to traditionally urban areas and are prevented from living in areas closer to nature. Because there is limited ability to have the ability to purchase homes, you have an inaccessibility of social mobility. That means that you cannot raise outside of your cultural or social status. There's very limited intergenerational wealth. Much of the wealth in this country is defined by how we go about giving our property to our children, ultimately funding their education and also the creation of economic development. That means that there's far less disposable income, far less leisure time, and ultimately what can best be described as a downward spiral of poverty that is regionally based, so that you have areas of economic and social degradation that are basically allowed to continue from one generation to the next. Much of what we experienced in the 1960s, we're actually still experiencing today. And despite the fact that we had a very active and very successful civil rights movement, much of what we experience today is reflected, sadly, in our national parks. And if you take a look at the overall civil rights movement, believe it or not, environmental conservation can actually be a part of that. And I think we need to look no further than a man by the name of Charles Madison Crenshaw, who in 1964 became the very first African-American to reach the summit of Denali. the highest peak in North America. And he was actually part of the 37th expedition to Denali, led by the Seattle Mountaineers. And as it happens, this happened as he was making his way to the summit of Denali in July of 1964. 7 days earlier, Lyndon Johnson, overlooked here by Martin Luther King Jr., signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And ironically, he quite literally gave license to allow Crenshaw and anyone else to achieve what has been described as King's mountain dream, to reach the mountaintop, to allow freedom to ring from the hilltops and the summits of the world. And he was talking metaphorically, but an argument could be made to suggest he was actually speaking literally. And it is on this peak, 7 days after the signing of the Civil Rights Movement in 1964, that Crenshaw brought into reality what is ultimately the ability to freely go anywhere we want to, specifically in the wilds of our national parks. Because if you take a look at this photograph on the summit of Denali in 1964, then known as Mount McKinley, it's really difficult to tell who the African-American is in this photograph. As it happens, Crenshaw is the gentleman on the far left. On the right is Alan Randall, the expedition leader. In the middle is Alan's wife, Frances, who became the third woman to summit Denali on that same expedition. So as you can tell from this photograph, our mountains don't discriminate. So by extension, why should we? It's important to recognize that spending time in nature is not necessarily a feat of solidarity. This is actually an opportunity for us to have solidarity in our abilities to spend time in the outdoors. So much so that myself, working with an organization some of you might have heard of called the National Outdoor Leadership School, wanted to take the time to create a new movement to be able to present more people of color with opportunities to spend time in the outdoors in a meaningful way, to create a very high profile event where we recruited a number of athletes, climbers, and also social and environmental advocates to do something that had never been done before. Our goal was to put the first team of African-American climbers on the summit of Denali, and ultimately taking Crenshaw's original dream of 1964 and bring it forward into a modern vision that we ultimately called Expedition Denali. And from that, we created the documentary film An American Ascent, which was the subject of my book, The Adventure Gap, and also ultimately changed what we can define as the face of the outdoors. Quite literally, creating new characters and a new legacy of conservation around who spends time in nature, and quite literally creating a new set of characters and heroes that ultimately help us to redefine what it is to be an advocate in our national park system. Specifically, it is deliberately people of color. So that not unlike our ability to tell the story of the national parks at the very beginning, our team was invited to visit the Obama White House and ultimately helped to create a number of what can be described as affinity groups that ultimately are designed to create positive examples of people of color to specifically engage with communities from the Native American community, the Latino community, communities that are engaged and involved in the LGBTQ community, the Native women's community, a wide variety of different affinity groups that ultimately create a natural environment that is accessible and available to everyone. So that today, when we stop and we think about what it means to be a person in the outdoors, we can categorically say that it does indeed include everyone. I want to say thank you for allowing me to present today. I, along with John, will be here to answer your questions. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn back the remainder of my time and hopefully open this up to a broad conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, James. That was absolutely amazing, and I'm always very inspired by your presentations. Let's move forward with a question that has popped up in the Q&A for you. And this question, I believe, is from, let me make sure I'm looking at this right, because there's a lot popping up in here. From Jira Oliver. What types of action steps can be leveraged to help involve more Black people in outdoor activities / national park visitation?
Well, personally, and I think that there's many ways we can do this. As I mentioned before, I mean, one of the things that is necessary is that we remove the barriers to access, and sometimes those barriers can be physical, like proximity, so in that case, providing transportation can be a good point of access. Another aspect of it too is, creating positive role models. And with that, I think comes, positive interpretation, finding and telling stories like a few of the ones that I just told you. How do we go about creating positive role models to allow people to see themselves as part of the natural environment? I think another thing that's critically important is being able to kind of decolonize our thoughts around spending time in nature. And by that, I mean, we put a lot of stock into conquering nature. We put a lot of stock in being able to say, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be rugged. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to spend time in this national park in a very aggressive way. That turns a lot of people off. And I think that if we can start imagining relationships with the outdoors that begin a little bit more gently, like in our city parks, so that we're talking about taking walks as opposed to taking hikes, so that we are, doing infinitely less in the way of, making it seem inaccessible. I think that we need to do more to make our natural spaces more accessible, so that when we start thinking about how do we get people engaged and involved, we need to make it culturally and socially relevant. And to do that, we need to make it as easy for anyone who doesn't see themselves as part of the natural environment to say, wow, I do have a place here, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to spending more time.
All right, thank you for that. This next question is from Melissa. My husband and I did a national park trip in 2015, and I was struck by the whiteness of park visitors. There were more international visitors in large groups on buses than people of color. I've wondered ever since what the issues were, and I was led to the question, how much does overt racism prevent Black Americans from wanting to travel to areas that are so white?
Well, I mean, overt racism it's relative, and that is up to and including, like, especially if you're in the South and you see a lot of pickup trucks with Confederate flags, that can be very off-putting to people. And as it happens, I'm not kidding you, just this weekend, I led a small group of African-American men on their first hiking trip in the North Woods of Wisconsin, and driving right past our hotel in the middle of central Wisconsin was a pickup truck with a Confederate flag flying out the back. And so the unfortunate perception is that there are people who don't want people of color there. And sadly, those interpretations get reinforced when we see things like that. When we don't have our stories told, when we don't see ourselves in popular magazines, and when we don't see ourselves in films or in catalogs or in brochures, it's at that point we start thinking, well, Jesus, do I really belong there? The reality is that as interpreters, as park managers, it's kind of our responsibility to make sure that we are telling the story that is welcoming to everybody. Now, the question was, does overt racism create a barrier? The answer is technically yes, but what is overt racism? And people shouldn't think that overt racism is limited to someone standing there saying, you can't come in. Sometimes overt racism is someone telling you that you're welcome to come in, but we want you to come in as one of us. We don't want you to You know, we want you to leave your music behind. We want you to leave your art behind. We want you to leave your culture behind. We want you to be just like us, but you're welcome to come. No, we needed to make an interpretation that is welcoming to everybody. And that means showing pictures, telling stories, and, you know, creating narratives that is inclusive of the experience of everyone, not just the people who we typically see.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few more minutes before we need to transition. I'm going to move on to the next question. What can white folks do to help bring people of color to parks? Essentially, how can we be better allies?
You know, I think the best thing you can do is, you know, and chances are every person on this call has a person of color in their lives who have told them that perhaps that this isn't for them, they're not interested in going. And I think that the best things that allies can do is to help to create experiences and invite your friends to come, you know, and to figure out what you can do to make them more comfortable, regardless of what it is. Like, for example, this trip that I just led, I was hoping that it was going to be a backpacking trip and that we would spend a night in tents and sleeping bags and do the things that people do. That was a deal breaker for a lot of people who could have participated in this. So what did I do? I went out and I found a collection of rustic cabins that we could get affordably, and then invited people to come. Once they had a bed to sleep in and a shower and maybe even, you know, Wi-Fi and a television set, we had a full day of an 8-mile round trip hike in the rain that everyone was excited to participate in. You know, and I think a big part of it is literally just, you know, creating an environment that is welcoming and engaging with a minimum level of, I guess, aversion. You know, the thing that you know, makes people not want to do something, try to eliminate those barriers. The next thing you know, you'll get people to join you. If you take a look at my Facebook feed right now, dozens of people have chimed in to say, wow, that looked like it was amazing. Can we come on the next one? You know, and I'm hoping that the next time we do, we'll find some people who will be willing to camp. But it's incremental, and I think that we need to make these changes over time. You know, and the thing is, though, that what I did for this group, anybody can do. You know, we just need to make sure that we address whatever the aversion or apprehension is and make it more accessible.
Thank you. Just make sure. Okay. We are going to transition over to wrapping up with Jeff Sharp. Thank you so much, James, for your presentation.
My pleasure.
Let's move on.
Hopefully my internet holds up this time, but thank you very much to Nate, John, and James, and to everyone who asked your questions. You've given us much to think about today, and we will seek to join you in getting involved in more efforts to continue preserving our national parks and public lands. I have to say two things that stood out to me. One is just the usage statistics on sort of how many visitors there are to the national parks and how the staffing has declined. You know, it's amazing with COVID here, the amount of people I'm seeing and hearing going to our Columbus Metro parks. What a tremendous resource and how blessed we are. And it's so wonderful that we're going to have some permanent funding there, but it looks like we have a lot ahead of us to continue in sustaining that support for these wonderful resources we have at all our levels of government. Additionally, I'll say that a big shout out to Nicole for doing a wonderful job of challenging us and helping us think about these issues of diversity through today's program, as well as some of the programs we had last year. It's really sort of sinking in, I think, hopefully to our community, the importance of us being inclusive and trying to sort of like be allies and sort of like help make the wonderful natural resources we have available for everyone. So thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you to Nicole for all your work and sort of helping bring this kind of programming to us. As is our EPN tradition, we want to recognize all three of our speakers with a certificate of appreciation and thanks for your participation today, albeit in electronic form. You, along with many environmental professionals who participated today, are helping us learn for life and to positively shape our world. If you would like to stay engaged with today's webinar discussion, please be sure to check out Public Trust film screening and post-screening discussions happening next Tuesday, September 22nd. Please contact Nicole Jackson directly for more details and to register for this virtual event. Well, that concludes today's program. Please note that the EPN will be back on Tuesday, October 13th with a virtual event that will feature Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and the places we live. This should be a great program we have coming up here. We've had her here before, and very interesting to hear her perspective. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people. She and a panel of Ohio leaders and scientists will convene here virtually on October 13th to discuss the politics and realities of climate change in the Buckeye State. Registration is now open for October's EPN. To register, visit epn.osu.edu. If you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out to Joe and Nicole. Thank you again to all for joining us today, and please stay safe and well connected.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.